They don't back down. Even wounded, they keep fighting. The phrase didn't originate in London, nor from a fiery speech. It appears in a German report drafted in Arnhem, September 1944. The paper was stained with mud, sweat, and urgency. The officer who wrote it wasn't trying to impress his superiors. He was trying to understand what was happening. The Germans were used to nicknames, almost always derogatory ones. Russians were called masses. Americans, undisciplined industrialists. But that week, something different emerged in the conversations between officers, in the orders shouted among the ruins, in the personal diaries written at night with trembling hands. Red Devils. It wasn't an official term, it wasn't propaganda. It was an emotional attempt to give form to fear. From the German point of view, that made no sense. Airborne troops were supposed to be fragile after the jump, disorganized, dependent on rapid reinforcements. In Arnhem, the men of Airborne Division, they were isolated, surrounded by makeshift armored units, with limited ammunition and no guarantee of rescue. Still, they did not give in. The reports describe fighting in already burned-out houses, positions retaken at gunpoint, British soldiers fighting for hours after being wounded, not out of fanaticism, but because silent discipline. For the Germans, it was reminiscent of something they knew well. Desperate, stubborn, almost irrational struggle, but carried out methodically. And then came the name. Damn! Because of the feeling of facing something that didn't obey the logic of the battlefield. Reds, because of the beret, but also because of the constant blood mixed with the dust of the Dutch bricks. Initially, the nickname doesn't carry a clear expression of admiration. It stems from shock from the discomfort of realizing that the enemy was not behaving as it should. But the question that remains, and which no report immediately answers, is simple and disturbing. What exactly did these men do on the ground in Arnhem to transform surprise into respect? If you feel pride, write about the strength, discipline, and resilience of English soldiers. Pride in the comments. And if stories like this deserve to continue being told with respect and depth, subscribing to the channel is the simplest way to keep this memory alive. For the German officers stationed in the Netherlands in September 1944, the logic seemed sound, almost comfortable. The Allied airborne forces were known, studied, classified, light troops. Courageous, yes, but dependent on speed, surprise, and quick rescue. If the reinforcement failed, they were supposed to collapse. That was the manual, and the manual rarely failed. Initial reports indicated that the British had jumped too far, too dispersed, with overly ambitious objectives. From the German point of view, Arnhem would not be a battle. It would be a temporary containment operation. All we needed was to buy some time. The mistake starts there. The Germans believed they were dealing with a standard airborne force. They didn't realize that among those men was the 1st Airborne Division, a unit designed not to retreat, but to hold on. His training didn't revolve around the idea of rapid extraction, but rather of extreme self-sufficiency. Each soldier knew he could be isolated for days, and he acted accordingly. German documents captured after the battle reveal a crucial detail. Reich intelligence overestimated the importance of logistics and underestimated the British human factor. According to German analysts, without heavy artillery and constant air support, the resistance would naturally collapse. What they didn't factor into their calculations was the psychological discipline. In Arnhem, the British didn't panic when the radios failed. They didn't break lines when they realized the German tanks were closer than anticipated. On the contrary, they shrunk the perimeter. They reorganized local commands and transformed civilian homes, schools, and administrative buildings into small, interconnected fortresses. From the German point of view, this was deeply disconcerting. A German officer described in a report that British positions seemed to disappear during the day and reappear at night. It wasn't an illusion, it was a method. Small groups changed position, retreated a few meters, and reappeared at unexpected angles. For those trying to map the resistance, the feeling was of facing a force, much bigger than it actually was. Another critical mistake was believing that a lack of supplies would quickly break morale. Instead, the Germans observed something rare even on the Eastern Front. Soldiers who they continued to obey orders that no longer came from Central Command, but from a shared understanding of the mission. There was no theatrical heroism. There was routine under fire. German surprise grows when patrols report wounded Britons refusing improvised evacuation. When officers realize that captured prisoners show no signs of emotional collapse, they don't plead, they don't provide information. They just wait. This behavior did not fit the narrative that the Reich had constructed about the British after 1940, that of a declining army, dependent on younger and industrially superior allies. Arnhem dismantles this image in a few days. The miscalculation, therefore, was not merely tactical, it was cultural. The Germans expected to find soldiers fighting until they realized they were lost. They found men who they already knew they were surrounded, and that they had accepted this even before setting foot on Dutch soil. It is at this point that the language changes in the documents. Terms such as containment and cleaning begin to disappear. Words such as stubborn resistance, prolonged unexpected combat, and in less formal notes, expressions that depart from military coldness emerge. The nickname isn't official yet, but respect is starting to grow. If the Germans were so wrong in their calculations, the inevitable question is, what was the first moment during the actual combat when they realized that Arnhem wouldn't be quick or simple? If, up to that point, German officers still believed that Arnhem could be controlled, that certainty died in the first real urban combat, not on maps, not in reports. But the instant German patrols tried to advance through the city's narrow streets and discovered that every corner was already occupied, Arnhem was not. An open field. It was not a small village. It was a city of solid buildings, narrow streets, parks, bridges, and residential neighborhoods, a perfect labyrinth for those who know how to fight when outnumbered. And it was there that the Germans realized they weren't just facing paratroopers. They were facing men who knew turning land into a weapon. Within the logic of Operation Market Garden, Arnhem was supposed to be the swift endpoint. Capturing the bridge and linking up with ground forces would conclude the mission. On the German side, the expectation was simple: delay, wear down, wait for the natural collapse of the airborne force. But what happened in the first few hours dismantled that logic. German reports describe initial attempts at recognition that ended in precise crossfire, coming from positions that did not appear on the maps. Ordinary houses, civilian residences, had been quietly adapted into defensive points, windows covered, interior walls broken to allow movement, without exposure. Roofs used as makeshift observation posts. To the Germans, it didn't look like improvisation. It looked like advance preparation. The biggest shock came when they realized that the British weren't just concentrated around the bridge. They were scattered, creating pockets of resistance that delayed any attempt at coordinated advance. A street taken did not mean control of the block. A building cleared did not guarantee security in the next one. And, even more disturbingly, the British, they counterattacked. Small groups emerged from areas considered safe, attacked flanks, and retreated before artillery could be adjusted. From the German point of view, it was like facing a force that it dissolved and reappeared, always at the worst possible time. A German officer described Arnhem as a fighting city, but in less formal records, the distinction begins to emerge. It wasn't the city. It was those men in berets moving with an almost unnatural calm under heavy fire. The sea unexpected presence of German armored vehicles should have resolved the problem quickly, but the urban terrain negated their advantage. Narrow streets, limited visibility, constant risk of ambushes. The British knew this and exploited every inch. At this point, the calculation error from the previous topic ceases to be theoretical. It becomes lived experience. Every advance took time. Each block required more men than anticipated, and each delay increased the feeling that something was wrong. Arnhem was not holding back beyond expectations. Arnhem was teaching a lesson. This is where the nickname begins to circulate more frequently, not as an isolated insult, but as a form of identification. A quick way to explain to newcomers what awaited them: watch out, those guys over there are the Red Devils. But what happened when the siege closed in completely, when ammunition, food, and hope began to run out? It is at this moment that the fight ceases to be merely tactical and becomes personal. When the net finally closed in, there was no announcement, no clear order, no symbolic moment. The Germans simply realized that this time the British had nowhere else to retreat. The routes were cut off. Communications were fragmented. German artillery was beginning to fall with greater precision. For any other type of airborne unit, that would have been the expected breaking point, the moment when the manual would finally prove correct. But Arnhem followed a different logic. German reports describe a disturbing shift in British behavior from that point onward. Instead of a desperate and chaotic defense, what emerges is something almost methodical. The positions no longer expand. They thicken. The lines don't move forward. They harden. The Germans are beginning to notice a pattern. The smaller the British perimeter, the more difficult it became to penetrate. Fighting began to take place inside partially destroyed houses, between walls that still held family photos. Furniture turned into makeshift barricades, and staircases transformed into deadly bottlenecks. There was no longer a front line. Each building was a micro-battlefield. At night, the psychological impact intensified. German soldiers reported feeling as though the enemy never slept. British troops would suddenly appear at supposedly safe points, launch swift attacks, and disappear before reinforcements could be called. In other instances, they would remain motionless for hours, waiting for the exact moment to react. The most disturbing detail, recurrent in the accounts, is not the violence, it's the calm. A German officer wrote that the British fought as if the outcome was already decided, and it didn't bother them. For those coming from a doctrine where morale and offensive drive were vital, this stance was deeply destabilizing. The wounded refused to be evacuated if it compromised their position. Isolated groups continued to carry out orders given hours, sometimes days, before, even, without any confirmation from superior command. It wasn't disobedience, it was absolute continuity of the mission. At this point, the combat ceases to be merely a dispute over territory. It becomes a psychological experience for the Germans. Each advance cost more than anticipated. Every local victory seemed irrelevant in the face of the enemy's persistence. This is where the nickname Red Devils takes on a whole new meaning. No longer just for the beret, no longer just for the blood, but for the feeling of facing men who they did not react to the siege as ordinary men would. The Germans were used to seeing collapse when hope ran out. In Arnhem, hope doesn't disappear. It transforms into something colder, more silent, an acceptance that, paradoxically, made the British even more dangerous. But to what extent was this resistance the result of training? And to what extent was it something deeper, almost cultural? This begins to become clear when the Germans start observing not only how the British fought, but because they continued fighting. If British resistance had already surprised the Germans, now a more uncomfortable, almost intimate question arose. Why did those men continue fighting like that, even when everything indicated that the mission had failed? The initial German response was simple and wrong: fanaticism. In the initial reports, some officers attempted to frame British behavior within the Reich's own logic. Men indoctrinated to the extreme, blind to reality, driven by unrealistic orders. But this explanation did not hold up for long. Something essential to fanaticism was missing: emotional instability. What the Germans saw in Arnhem was the opposite. The British did not attack in a rage. They did not shout slogans. They did not seek symbolic gestures. They acted with economy of movement precision, and above all, disciplined autonomy. Each soldier seemed to know exactly how far he could go and when to stop. This begins to become clear in the interrogations of British prisoners. The Germans expected to find broken, confused men, resentful of their commanders. They found soldiers who spoke little, answered correctly, and demonstrated a calm understanding of their own situation. There was no illusion of immediate rescue. There were no heroic speeches. There was only the mission, understood, accepted, and executed to the best of its ability. This behavior was not accidental. It stemmed from a specific military culture deeply rooted in British Army and taken to the extreme in airborne units. From their training, these men were prepared to operate without orders, without supplies, and, if necessary, hopeless. For the Germans, this was deeply unsettling. German doctrine valued initiative, yes, but within a rigid command structure. At Arnhem, they faced soldiers who maintained cohesion even when that structure had been destroyed. British discipline did not depend on the presence of an officer shouting orders. It existed within the individual. A German officer wrote that the British seemed to fight less for victory and more for duty. This distinction is crucial. Duty doesn't need constant motivation. It simply needs to be fulfilled. It is at this point that the nickname Red Devils ceases to be merely an impressionistic description and begins to carry genuine respect for the Germans. It was unusual to face an enemy that did not react emotionally to imminent defeat, that neither accelerated nor broke down. It simply continued. In the eyes of the enemy, it seemed almost superhuman, but it wasn't. It was discipline taken to the extreme. It was military identification. It was the consequence of men being trained to accept, from the very first jump, that perhaps if there was no turning back. But even the most solid discipline finds its limit. When ammunition runs out, injuries accumulate, and time starts working against you. What happens when even that inner strength isn't enough to hold the line? That's what begins to emerge in the next chapter. Discipline had brought the British this far, but now even she was beginning to find her limits. In Arnhem, ammunition was becoming scarce, not as a logistical abstraction, but as a physical reality. Empty pockets, incomplete magazines, weapons too silent. Wounds were piling up. The perimeter was shrinking once again, and on the German side the perception was clear. That couldn't last much longer. It was precisely at this point that something changed. German reports begin to record a curious phenomenon. Even when British resistance finally gave way, she didn't collapse. There was no disorderly retreat. There was no mass surrender. What was seen were small positions being abandoned only when they became militarily useless, and not before. For the Germans, this was an unmistakable sign of extreme professionalism. A German officer described how the British knew exactly when to stop fighting. This dry, objective phrase carries enormous weight. It indicates that the enemy was not being defeated emotionally but consciously, shutting down their combat capability. It is at this stage that the nickname Red Devils ceases to circulate only among soldiers on the front lines and begins to appear in wider communications, not as bravado, but as linguistic shortcut, a quick way to alert new units about the type of adversary they were about to face. It's them, the Red Devils. The name comes to mean something specific. Men who fight to their functional limit, not beyond. Who don't waste energy on useless gestures. Who know how to lose without falling apart. Even in the capture of prisoners, the Germans notice something out of the ordinary. The British surrender when there is no real option left, and they do so with disconcerting calm. There is no visible psychological collapse, no exaggerated relief, just silence, exhaustion, and dignity. This creates an unexpected effect. German guards report difficulty in treating those prisoners as ordinary, defeated men. There is a tacit respect, a different distance. Some German officers even comment, in an almost reflective tone, that those men had done everything that could be done. For an army accustomed to despising the defeated enemy, this was no trivial matter. Arnhem, at that moment, ceases to be just an episode of Operation Market Garden. She becomes a moral reference point for the enemy, an example of how a unit can be defeated on the map and still win in the intangible realm of respect. The nickname Red Devils doesn't stem from victory. It stems from the recognition of human limitations taken to the extreme and respected to the very end. But the price of that reputation was too high to ignore. How many of these men never left Arnhem? And what remained, besides the name? Respect was earned, but it came with a bill that couldn't be ignored. When the fighting in Arnhem finally ceased, the silence that spread through the city was anything but triumphant. From the German point of view, the immediate objective had been achieved. The bridge had not fallen, the Allied advance had been halted, and the operation had lost momentum. No map. That was a clear defensive victory. No land. The feeling was different. The Germans walked between abandoned British positions and discovered something unsettling. Many of them had been held until the last usable cartridge. Broken, improvised, shared weapons. Defense points that weren't taken, they were simply abandoned when they no longer had military value. The numbers started arriving at the general staff, and they weren't abstract. Arnhem had come at a high price. For the British, thousands of men were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire units were reduced to fractions of what they had been days before. For the Germans, unexpectedly high losses for a force that theoretically should have been eliminated quickly. This is where the contradiction crystallizes. The operation failed strategically for the Allies. That's a historical fact. But for the Germans who fought there, Arnhem was not a comfortable victory. It was an alert. The realization that the British Army was still capable of producing units that did not disintegrate under maximum pressure. German post-combat reports avoid triumphalism. Instead, they speak of unparalleled resistance, prolonged combat capability without support, and high-quality enemy. Rare expressions for an army accustomed to downplaying its adversaries, even after fierce fighting. The nickname Red Devils survives precisely because of that. He survives the end of the battle because he resolves a psychological dilemma. How do you explain a victory that didn't feel like a victory? For the Germans, Arnhem proved that it was possible to defeat the British, but not break them. And that may have been the most lasting result of that battle. Not the bridge being held, not the delayed advance, but the certainty that if those men had received reinforcements, if the weather had been slightly different, the outcome could have been different. Among the British survivors, few spoke of glory. Most spoke of loss. Comrades left behind, names that never answered again. Arnhem became a heavy word, spoken with respect and sorrow. And that is precisely why the true legacy of this story is not in military reports, nor in strategic maps. He resides in what remains afterward, in the cemeteries, in local memories, and in the silence that persists to this day. That's where the story ends. And that's where it really starts to make sense. After the reports were filed, after the maps were updated, and the orders moved on to the next front, Arnhem was left behind. But it was not forgotten. The silence that followed the battle was neither the silence of victory nor that of utter defeat. It was a heavier silence, made of absence. Streets rebuilt, houses occupied by new families, children playing where weeks before men had fought to the limit of their bodies. For those passing through Arnhem today, almost nothing reveals what happened there. Almost. Military cemeteries tell the story that reports fail to convey. Rows of identical tombstones, repeated names, dates concentrated in a few days of September 1944. Men too young to have been called devils, and yet they received that name from the enemy. That's where the nickname takes on its ultimate meaning. Red Devils didn't survive because it sounded too strong. He survived because it was no exaggeration. German veterans who returned to the region decades later recognized the place with a quiet respect. Some mentioned Arnhem as one of the few battles they won without feeling triumphant. Others, in later interviews, admitted that it was the moment they realized the war wouldn't be decided by numbers or steel alone. For the British, Arnhem was never celebrated as a victory. It was remembered as a sacrifice, as proof that there were limits to what ordinary men could endure, and that, even so, those limits were surpassed. The legacy is not in the bridge, it's not in the school textbooks, it resides in the memories preserved by families, in medals kept in drawers, in stories told in hushed voices, and above all, it lies in the fact that the name was not chosen by those who fought there, but by those who tried to defeat them. In wars, medals are awarded to the victors, but respect that only the enemy can grant. If we still talk about the Red Devils today, it's not to glorify war. It's a reminder that, even in absolute chaos, human dignity can leave deeper scars than any victory on the map. Arnhem did not go down in history as a victory, but astral proof that men surrounded without rescue and without advantage can still command respect from the enemy. The nickname Red Devils didn't originate from propaganda. It was born from shock, discipline, and dignity pushed to the limit. If this story awakens pride in you, write pride in the comments. Leave a like so that this legacy remains visible, and by subscribing to the channel, you help ensure that these stories are not relegated to footnotes, but remembered as they deserve.